Hi everyone, welcome to Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. And we are here today for the panel, A Stronger Grid in the Face of Wildfires. I'm super excited today to talk about this important issue. And we are lucky to have wonderful panelists with us today, Elizabeth, Tim, and Caroline. I am Julie Godin. I volunteer at WCS on the event committee, and I am honored to be your moderator today. Meaning that I will be here to pass the baton to our great speakers who are the real experts on the topic here. So could we please move to the next slide? So thank you all for being here with us today and choosing to dedicate 1 hour of your time on this very nice summer evening to attend this event and learn more about wildfires and grid resiliency. So we'll start with some quick housekeeping items and then move on to the discussion with the panel. And after that, we'll have some dedicated time for Q&A. So don't hesitate to drop your questions in the chat throughout the event, and we'll be taking questions from the audience. Next slide, please. So some Zoom etiquette before we start. You're all probably pretty familiar with it after 2 years of virtual meetings, but a few reminders. So please write your full name, turn on your video if you feel comfortable doing so, and because we love to see your faces as well. And out of respect for speakers, please mute yourself during the call, except when you have a question to ask. And we also encourage you to put your LinkedIns in the chat, connect with other attendees, because the more you get involved and active during this event, the more you benefit from it. Next slide, please. So who are we? Women in Cleantech and Sustainability is a nonprofit originally founded in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, we are in 13 countries and we have a membership base of 500 professionals, men and women. The goal of this organization is to support women in their careers in the cleantech industry. We are lucky to be celebrating our 10 years this year, which is pretty impressive considering that we are a nonprofit entirely run by volunteers. And so what do we do at WCS? We have monthly events like this panel that you're on. We have social events. We also have a mentorship program. I was lucky to participate in this mentorship program last year. We got a mentor. It was super helpful, so I highly encourage you to participate in this. We also have a startup pitch competition and our flagship event, which is coming back in October this month, which is our annual WCS Talks. So I encourage you to mark your calendars. Next slide, please. We also have a scholarship program, which is a way for WCS to expand our network, to diversify our network, and also to make our membership more affordable for people who may need it. We still have extra opening currently, so if you know anyone who might benefit from this scholarship, please do encourage them to apply. Next slide, please. So some upcoming events as well. Next week, we have a meeting from the LA Chapter Book Club, which will discuss donut economics. Feel free to join, even if you're not in the LA region. In 2 weeks, we are coming back in person in San Francisco for a summer social. Please join, it's gonna be great to see actual people again. And then we have in August, an executive leadership workshop. This is gonna be a great event as well. Next slide, please. So in case you're not yet a WCS member, I encourage you to sign up, just scan the QR code to do so, and you'll also get reimbursed from tonight's event. And feel free to reach out to me or any other WCS member on the call if you have any questions about the membership. Next slide, please. So a little about myself. I'm Julie Godin and I'll be your moderator today. And now a little primer on why we're here before I introduce our speakers. So as we all know, wildfires are an increasing issue globally, partly because of impacts from climate change. And in fact, wildfire season has already started this year in California, which is extremely sad. And today, 50% of wildfires are caused by an issue linked to power lines, and those fires are getting increasingly destructive. So utilities are progressively taking measures to mitigate risks. And for instance, in California alone, utilities are expected to collectively spend more than $15 billion to reduce the threat of wildfires caused by the power grids for this year alone, so it's huge. And meanwhile, the grid needs to adapt to support an increasing share of renewables, which add to the complexity of the system. So today we have 3 great experts that we talk about what we can do to improve the situation. So I'm really happy to introduce our panelists to you. First, we have Elizabeth Reid. Beth is the founder and CEO at Olivine. She has most recently been spearheading the development and execution of the Emergency Load Reduction Program on behalf of PG&E and Southern California Edison. Olivine also developed Climate Response, which engages end users by educating them on what actions to take to save energy, while offering incentive for program participation. Next up, we have Tim Barrett. Tim is the CEO and co-founder of Gridware. He was recently named in Forbes' annual 30 under 30 list of innovators, congratulations Tim, for developing a 24/7 monitoring system that increases the visibility of potential threats along power distribution lines. This system streamlines the health of the grid directly into the hands that need it most, utilities and first responders. And last but certainly not least, we have Director Caroline Thomas-Jacobs. Caroline was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom in July 2021 as the first director of the new Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety under the California Natural Resources Agency. Prior to that, Director Thomas-Jacobs held leadership roles at the California Public Utilities Commission and at the California Office of Emergency Services, where she worked on disaster response and utility-related wildfires issue, including the initial implementation of public safety power shutoffs by California utilities. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'd like to kick it off by going back to basics because this is a pretty complex topic. So how would you explain what grid resiliency is to an 8 years old? 8 years old. So maybe Beth, you could start us off and maybe tell us a little bit about how Olivine make this topic understandable to customers.
Sure. Well, it's always hard to explain it to customers, and it's always hard for us to explain what we do, even to people in the industry. I think if I was talking to an 8-year-old, I would try to keep it as simple as possible and talk to them about the fact that the grid is what is powering your iPad and your telephone and all the tools and devices that you need. You need that electricity. And to keep the grid solid, to keep it strong, what we really need to do is think about it as if humans, you're standing there and you don't want to be easily blown down, right? You're standing somewhere and somebody can push you down, or if there's wind and you can push it down. We don't want that kind of situation with the grid. We want the grid to stand strong so that you never have a problem. And the way to do that is to make sure it's balanced. Just like if you're standing there and somebody's, wind is blowing or somebody's going to knock you down, you need to stand strong. And you need to be balanced. So you need to make sure you're not leaning too far back or too far front. And so what you're looking about as being balanced is you have as much power coming in as you need to take out. And so I tend to think about it like standing somewhere, and the push in the front and the push in the back have to be equal in order to stand tall. So I have actually used a story like that with an 8-year-old, well, actually a 9-year-old. And I'm not sure they fully got all the picture, but they did understand the idea that something needs to be balanced.
Oh, really cool. Caroline, how about yourself?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think of it. Since I come from a background in emergencies, I think of resiliency is that when exceptional things happen, that you're in a position to withstand those exceptional actions. So in the grid scenario, given that we're having more extreme heat, and so there's a bigger draw on the grid, as well as obviously we're having more wildfires, that the grid is resilient to withstanding when those events occur. But also if it is to go down, so if it's something bad does happen to the grid, that it's in a position to quickly be restored. So resilience is about trying to withstand against the initial issue that is being presented, but if there is an issue that happens, that it also can quickly come back up. So response and restoration is just as important.
Got it, really clear. Tim, anything to add? You're on mute.
I think I very much think about this similarly to Carolyn as well. We are really focused on the restoration side of things at the moment. And so the way that we approach resilience is preparing the grid to weather the knocks, right? So when you have these extreme events, if you had an understanding of how prepared you are to take those knocks. If you were to determine that you were not ready, then you can make additional preparations for those events. And you can look at this through the lens of human health. We do blood checks every year, and we kind of get an understanding of where our immune system is right now. And so then if we get inserted into an area where there is some virus, our body either is, if we're healthy, we're eating our vegetables, and the immune system is ready to fight against the virus, we're going to fare better. But you need to know that, and that's why you go and do that testing. So that's the way that I think about resilience, is an awareness of the current state of the grid, and an understanding of how you can move to be more resilient to face the punches.
Got it. Cool. We had the metaphor on the wind, a metaphor on the punches and the health. I think we have like a 360 on what a grid resiliency is. So thank you so much for those answers. And my second question is like a bit similar to that. So it's like, why is grid resiliency like so important? I guess, why are we increasingly talking about this topic? I don't know if Caroline, you want to start, since you worked on the implementation of the public safety power shutoffs. I don't know if you could tell us what are those? How do they contribute to grid resiliency?
Yeah, so resiliency, I think, is becoming more and more important. I don't come from the electrical industry, right? So my background, again, is in emergency management. And when I came over, it was in 2020. So when I first was appointed to stand up the Wildfire Safety Division, which was the first iteration of the office that we are today, over at the Public Utilities Commission, to address this issue of wildfire safety in electrical corporations here in California. It was really interesting to me to find out that the history of the electric grid across the US, but in California in particular, is it wasn't built with the assumption that the climate was going to change. And so, what we're discovering is that the old ways that they were doing business in terms of how they built the grid, how they run the grid, and how they maintain the grid, those practices were no longer being able to withstand the everyday climate that was beginning to emerge here in California. So it was really important to quickly change. I know you have a question lined up to talk more about what we've done specifically here in California, so I'll save that piece for that question. But what we've experienced is just in the last 5 years, there's been a rapid shift with how we need to think about building, operating, and maintaining the grid.
Yeah, definitely. We can see that in the headlines. I don't know if Tim, you want to expand on this point?
I remember when I was younger, and the power would go out, we would light up a candle, switch on the gas stove, and enjoy a cup of tea. But now we're totally reliant on power as a society, and increasingly so, right? We're migrating to electric vehicles. People are working from home, and they need reliable internet and power for their devices to actually be productive. And so, to your question of why does grid resiliency matter? Well, as Carolyn said, and as we've observed, everything's changing in terms of the environment and stress that the equipment faces on the daily basis. It wasn't designed to have these extreme, not just extreme temperatures, but the swings, right? And we're seeing, like right now, I'm in Utah. I was meeting with one of our utility customers, and usually they would have had immense amounts of rain right now, and they're in complete drought. They didn't have any snow, and their pad mount transformers are going 5 or 6 per week.
Wow.
And so it's really important that we really surface grid resiliency as an important issue, because as a society, we're becoming very, very reliant on electricity. And the grid is the infrastructure and backbone for, it's the largest and most critical network in the whole world.
Yeah, I want my iPad to still remain on. I don't know, Beth, if you want to add a couple of points on this question.
Sure, I guess I could. I just to try to, like, just what Tim had before is like, well, we kind of can echo the same things, but I would say one of the things that our company looks at it a little bit differently. I mean, obviously that's the foundation, but I tend to think about the grid as though it just is an illustration of how interconnected we are, which is really supporting the point that Tim made. But it's a really obvious thing about how interconnected we are. And when we look at climate change and sustainability, it's all about that interconnection. I can't be okay if everybody else is not. And the grid brings all that together. And one of the things that was really I guess a game changer for me is about 5 years ago, I was involved in some work, and I would say that our company's focus is not on stopping climate change, because our company doesn't have the technology to really look at this. But you even go back years before anybody talked to me about, carbon sequestration or anything like that. We were focused on adaptation. Is if we're in this situation, how can we help people adapt to it so that we can adapt and also have a bit of a longer lead time where people can survive while some of these other technologies come to fruition. And about 5 years ago, I was working on a project, and I became really aware of the impact on people when there were power outages, when there was unexpected issues, and in the heat. And so this issue is just only getting worse and worse. I think it was in 2016, if I get the date right, there was something like 800,000 customers in California that had their power shut off that never had it turned back on. So yeah, never turned back on. So you've got to think about what happened to those people that were never and most of these people were shut off for non-payment. And now they were never able to get their power back on. And this is before this went into effect, but some high percentage, something like 80% of those people were medical baseline customers. There were people who relied on the electricity basically to stay alive. And they can't survive without air conditioning as well in a high heat environment. And so that really propelled me to think about this a little bit different, and to try to think about how we could look at the grid and all the players on the grid as part of an extension of the equipment. So all the resources and all the people on it are an extension of that equipment. And how can all of us help each other to adapt to the climate change?
Yeah, if I can add on to that, because I think Beth hits on a really important point that, there's modern everyday daily life activities obviously are becoming more and more electrified. But what Beth is hitting on is that it's also about critical lifelines that are also becoming more and more connected and dependent on electricity. So medical baseline and that's sort of an industry term, but basically what that means, it's people who have medical devices that they are dependent on for life support that they require, and it's a specific program in the electrical industry, but it's also broader vulnerable communities. So even people that are not necessarily technically registered as medical baseline, there are vast numbers of people who have life safety dependent mechanisms that are dependent on electricity. For example, diabetics with their insulin, right? You need to keep it cold and you want to keep it refrigerated. So there's entire populations. And also importantly, our public safety systems are dependent on electricity. So, as we've modernized a lot of the tools that public safety, fire, law, emergency services use to respond, the healthcare industry, they also are dependent on electricity. So when the power goes out, it has a severe impact immediately on other mechanisms that are important to maintaining the health of the community.
Got it. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So I have another question. I think I'm gonna go quick on that one, but Tim, this one is for you. So what are the most common causes of power outages? And maybe you could share, the most recurring issues spotted by grid wear, for instance, which could lead to power outages.
So I'm actually a former lineman. I dropped out of high school when I was 15 to climb poles, and I have a lot of insight into this problem. I think a lot of people don't appreciate the magnitude of the grid. I was just typing through some facts. If there's 240,000 miles of distribution power lines in California, that's from the Earth to the moon. The distance from the Earth to the moon is 238,000 miles. And now you have to appreciate that every single day, nothing can come into contact with those lines. Hundreds of millions of components, bolts, transformers, insulators, cross arms, poles, all have to function or essentially not fail just so you can switch the light on. And we just don't appreciate that. As a lineman, I do, right? Every time I switch the switch, is it going to work, right? Because I've seen all the ways that you can fail. But to answer your question more concretely, the four leading causes of outages are weather, which we've already talked about. Humans, cars coming into contact with poles is generally the biggest one. Equipment failure, and then animals. Specifically in California, it's generally vegetation contact and animal contact that causes outages. Right, very clear. Yeah. During 4th of July this year, I saw people shooting fireworks straight under power lines. I was like, huh, this is a good idea. Okay. Anyway, I don't know if Caroline and Beth, you want to add anything to this question. Otherwise, I have a lot coming up.
Yeah, I'll just add in, and I'll get to this later when you get to the question about what we do. But we oversee the wildfire mitigation plans. And one of the key elements that we require the utilities to do is submit to us all of the ignition drivers, because obviously so that they can prioritize, right, in terms of what they're doing to reduce that potential for ignition. First thing you need to do is what's causing ignitions. So just supporting Tim, contact by object, number one, and then equipment failure, number two. Now, contact of object could be a human, it could be an animal, it could be a balloon, one of those metallic balloons. It could be vegetation, it could be lots of things. But those are the top two drivers. And so it's really important for the utilities to be able to categorize that data and collect that data and know what caused the ignition so that they can prioritize the specific actions to improve how they build, operate, and maintain the grid to eliminate that potential ignition in the future.
And one thing I would add to that, which is a different reason, and it's not one of the top reasons, but it's becoming increasingly concerning, is when demand might be higher than supply. And the utilities do a lot of planning, and they work with the California ISO, which is the California grid operator, and they do a lot of planning. And in 2020, and this is triggered by wildfires. So this is all, again, how these things are all connected. But you have wildfires and the heat, all this stuff is, everything is complicit, right, in these perfect storms. But in 2020, we were almost at blackout level. And it was really a situation that was in a planning exercise. So people who are in utilities might understand this. You do these like worst case scenario exercises, is like 1 in 10 years, and it does affect the climate. This was a 1 in 30-year chance of something like this happening. And so now it's looking much more like a 1 in 10 year or even less. So you can see as the climate's getting worse, as the chances of wildfires are going up, that we are starting to have an effect of that, where we're at risk for supply not being available enough to cover demand.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, another, like often that's the reason why, like, yeah, reason of power outage. Okay, so what would you say is the responsibility of utilities in preventing wildfires, specifically along power lines? I don't know, Caroline, if you want to start on this one.
Sure. So in California, the utilities have a responsibility to run their grid safely. So that means that whether it's ignition or any other type of safety incident, they have sole responsibility to ensure that they're identifying what are the potential safety risks and then doing something about that so that their equipment doesn't cause an ignition or, worst case, a catastrophic wildfire. So that responsibility does rest with them. Again, one of the key elements that we've seen is that the potential for their equipment, because of climate change and the change in the weather conditions and the fuel load, that's a technical term, but basically literally how much fuel is on the ground, so that if that equipment fails and drops something hot on the ground, is it likely to turn into an ignition? That is increasing. The risk of that is increasing because literally our landscape is becoming more vulnerable to wildfire. So there is an urgency to a speed of addressing the potential causes of ignitions from infrastructure, and hence why our department was created.
Got it. Beth, do you want to follow up on this, since I think you also like deploy the program like on behalf of utilities?
We do. I think that that's a good point. I think the utilities, to Carolyn's point, I think the utilities have a responsibility to not only deal with the equipment, and it's really going back to Tim's point too about the infrastructure, and all those things are connected. One big thing that I would jump off of is I really notice a significant difference. So we help the utilities run some emergency programs, because I think that is also part of the utilities' responsibility to also look at mitigation, but also look at adaptation and look at what they can do. And so we help them run some emergency programs. And one of the things that is just so evident when I'm looking at different possible participants is the distinction when you have the money and you're putting the energy into having power lines underground, into monitoring, all those kinds of things, I think are also part of that big picture and part of the utilities' responsibility.
Definitely. Tim, do you want to close on that question?
One of the terms we use in the industry is overloading. And there's two types of overloading. You've got, or two main types that we care about in this context is heat overloading of the equipment and wind overloading of the equipment. Both of these are associated with extreme weather, right? And so getting first an understanding of how heat and wind impacts the infrastructure in a way now that we haven't designed it is the first task for the utilities. You know, we have these new environments for the equipment. How are they going to respond to these new environments? And as it continues to change, how are they going to respond? And then once you have that understanding, it's then the responsibility of the utilities to address that and adapt. But it's important that it happens in this order.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I have one last question before we open the floor to the audience, and I have more just in case. But my question on the regulations. So I think, Caroline, we can start with you. So are there any regulations or guidelines shared by the state on this topic? And I think, Caroline, you have a whole plan just for that from you.
Yeah, so I kind of teed it up already in a couple of my responses, but I didn't want to get ahead of you. So yes, so in California, basically, after the 2017 and 2018 fires, right? So the North Bay fires, the Thomas fire down in the south in 17, obviously the Camp Fire in 2018. After those fires, the state legislature and the Newsom administration clearly identified that there was an issue with needing to more directly regulate the electrical corporations on wildfire safety specifically. So they created what's a new regulatory scheme. And that regulatory scheme, that sort of the main vehicle of that regulation, is called the Wildfire Mitigation Plan. Each of the 8 investor-owned utilities is required to submit to our office an annual wildfire mitigation plan. And then our office reviews it and approves or denies it. And then they have to execute that plan. And we have a whole compliance division that makes sure that they actually do the plan or implement the plan. But basically what that plan really boils down to is it is a articulation by the utilities on, first, how do they understand their wildfire risk? And I'll give a little bit of detail on each one of these. Second, what are they going to do about that risk? And then third, how are they improving that over time? And the improving that over time is really important because this is all new. This is groundbreaking, industry-leading thinking on how to understand risk and then change how you build, operate, and maintain the grid based on that risk. It's leading. So so it's every year it's improving and evolving. But understanding the risk, it starts with that. And they're developing wildfire risk models. You know, rewind 5 years ago, these risk models didn't exist. And so every year we are continuing to help them mature their ability to gather data, ingest that data, analyze that data, and understand what their risk is based on that data. And then they target their mitigation. So, you know, one thing might be for equipment failure, for example, it might say, hey, bare wires in certain environments maybe isn't a good idea anymore. So let's target, how are we going to change how that particular segment of the grid is built? Do we underground it? Do we cover it? Do we remove the line completely and do a microgrid, right? They have to identify where's the top priority to address that risk. And then, like I said, continually improve. So our team, like always, when we do get to an approval, because sometimes we require them to revise their plan before we approve it. When we do get to it, we always, in our approvals, also say how we expect them to continue to improve going into the next year, because of this continual improvement requirement, since it is such new space for the industry. So all of that is built out in California's regulatory scheme on utility wildfire safety.
Wow, that's really cool. That's a lot of work. Okay, great. So I have like one question on technologies and one on like action at individual scale, but I see we have a lot of questions from the audience. So Iris, I'll hand it over to you to take the questions from the chat.
Thank you very much. Susan asked the first question. It's great that we are bringing more renewable power projects online, but one problem that has been cited with them over fossil fuel is the intermittent nature. What do we need to do to better support the transition to green power?
Well, one of the things that I think we can do is a little bit of what my company is working on. So that's why I'm kind of a big believer in this, is in thinking about all these different resources, all these different technologies that are on the grid as an extension of the grid, you know, empowering those technologies. And so when we talk about like demand response programs, like traditionally it's what do you turn off? What we really need to look at now is how flexible things are. What can you turn on when? And how, and the timing of when things are needed is going to change. It changes continually. When I first started in this industry, the peaks were between 12 and 6, and now the real issues are between 4 and 9. When it's hot, it's hotter there now, and there's more problems. So I think that really trying to take a look at all the resources that are on the grid and empower them to be flexible. So, you know, battery backed. There's behavioral capabilities, there's control technologies, but making sure that you're looking as much as possible at how we can deal with that intermittent nature. I mean, batteries are an obvious, you know, thing to be thinking about, but it's not a silver bullet. There's got to be a lot of different pieces put in to allow for that intermittent nature and to be able to make sure that we have enough different types of resources on the grid to be able to leverage at different points in time.
I can go. I think there's this term that's floated around, is that we can move off the grid. You know, I'll have my battery, I'll have my solar panels, and I'll be fine. And we definitely need to move away from that because it's super inefficient, and more importantly, it's not resilient. And so I think the way that there's a couple of things that we need to do. First of all, creating a grid that's more adaptable in terms of being able to use it when we need it and use it less when we don't need it. And that requires more visibility. But I think really the lowest hanging fruit is standards and interoperability between all the different technologies. Because one of the biggest challenges for distributed energy resources and really our green future is, well, you've got OEMs that aren't necessarily incentivized to share data with the distribution plants. And so how do you manage or transact electricity when everybody's putting their data behind a firewall or for whatever incentives that they might have? And, you know, I don't have a clear understanding of what we can do. Maybe this is through regulation, maybe this is through new incentive structures, I don't know, but having more collaborative efforts between technology vendors, I think is the lowest hanging fruit.
I would have to say that from our experience in our company, that is our biggest barrier. to being able to implement the things that we want to implement or the designs that we have, you know, and we interact with the grid as well as these different distributed energy resources. I mean, that's really what our whole focus is. And the lack of a forcing mechanism, either the standards around interoperability, you know, we're, as Carolyn was talking about too, we're in a different world now and things have to adapt. The same thing is true on a commercial level too. You know, where is the IP, who controls what? I think that we have to, we aren't from an industry quite yet moving as fast as the actual problem is.
Thank you for great answers. The next question that Julia asked about, she's curious about the impact of animal contact on outage. What are the most common ways animals cause outages?
I can speak to that. At least in Northern California, the most common one is turkeys. They kind of roost up on the top of the tree and then they'll fly straight into the power lines. This is really bad because generally either they'll get fried, they'll fall to the ground, or there's two things. Either they push the power lines together momentarily and then there's an outage and then they fly off, or they get electrocuted, they fall to the ground. And here's the worst part. By the time a lineman can go out and find the bird, a coyote's come and dragged it away. So we don't even know why the outage occurred. And so we sit there for hours patrolling the lines, trying to figure out what happened. The other type is, you know, you might have raccoons or squirrels up in the transformers, or birds' nests up at the top of the, and those are a little easier to retrospectively determine the causes. But those turkeys, they're the biggest challenge, I think, in Northern California.
Yeah, I'll just add, critters that crawl and birds with wings. The critters that crawl get up on top of the poles, and there's a whole bunch of different connections at different places that either directly or when they touch two things at the same time, they create a current that then literally fries them. And like Tim mentioned, that actually what the ignition causes is they burn up and then they fall to the ground, and then they catch the ground on fire. And then the birds with the wings, they can, again, reach across. So there are, in the wildfire mitigation plans, one of the main, certainly not the only, but one of the top mitigations is going through the grid and putting animal guards on these different connectors, and or again, if they change to covered conductor, then they're limiting the likelihood that the wings spanning two lines can make that connection. So it's really important that they're on the top of the poles, making it so that less is exposed, so that an animal can't create a connection and then create a current.
Okay, next question. Jenna asked about, have you all seen an increase in or any trends around interest, awareness, investment being done in the realm of power electronics, engineering, and materials like wide bandgap semiconductors as avenues for enhancing grid resilience?
Can you read that one again? I didn't quite get all of it.
She asks about, have you all seen an increase in, or Jenny, if you in the audience, you can, if you want, you can.
Yeah. Sorry that I worded it confusingly. Basically, I was just curious if y'all have seen any increases or trends essentially in the awareness or like investment in just like hardware engineering or like power electronics engineering as potential avenues or focus points for avenues for enhancing grid resiliency, or like, you know, materials within it, like wide bandgap semiconductors and stuff to help with like the efficiency and connections and different things like that.
I can speak briefly on the work that we do at Gridware, right? We provide additional monitoring onto the grid to kind of solve a lot of the things that we've been talking about, but really equip the utilities with more information about their infrastructure so that we can actually start to make progress on developing new strategies and new products to avoid these wildfires. And to do that, we had to solve some very incredibly difficult engineering problems associated with power and the semiconductors and microprocessors that we need. So we've built hardware from the ground up. It needs to be highly power efficient. And when we're talking about 240,000 miles, you have to understand that even 0.001% increase in efficiency or cost across these products have huge impacts on the actual cost of deploying these technologies. And so, when you look at semiconductors and in power electronics, the things that we've built, if we can reduce the cost of our product by 1%, or maybe we've reduced the cost to ratepayers by $5 or $10 million. And so there is a lot of interest. But then, there are other companies that are working on less glamorous things like materials associated with covered conductor, or even new types of conductors that can carry more current more efficiently. One of the biggest problems with moving to increase loads associated with electric vehicles is you need more current. And so when you need more current, you need heavier power lines. And to support the heavier power lines, you need to rebuild all the infrastructure associated with that. And so we've seen companies now that are working on really, really cool materials that can more efficiently carry current without any additional weight. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
I'll just add into there, and I'm not an engineer, so can't get to the engineering side of it, but from a layperson's perspective, when it comes to wildfire mitigation and for the utilities to figure out how to address their risk, both before, during, and after a potential ignition, we absolutely have to innovate our way out of this problem. Really pushing the boundaries of exploring new emerging technologies is really critical. And I'll give you sort of examples on the before, during, and after. So before, right? So we ultimately want to find that failure before it happens, right? We want to find that thing that's about to break before it breaks so that they can address it. So there's a bunch of different, companies that are working on, trying to perfect this identification before the fault happens. In terms of during, so now a fault has happened. Now let's quickly identify that fault has happened and get there. So that's technology both to identify the fault, but also, because that fault could be an ignition, but also the response time, right? So it's changing how they operate in terms of responding, their situational awareness around identifying where it was, narrowing where it was. I mean, one of the big problems that today, still is a problem is depending on, where you are in the grid, it could be a really long part of the grid that you have to look to find out where that problem is. So narrowing the scope and making it narrow, a smaller and smaller area that you have to identify is really critical. And then again, sort of that resiliency of restoration. Okay, now you've found that where the fault is, improving the technology to be able to quickly respond and get it back up and running, or address, obviously, if there is an ignition, the fire more quickly, are all critical spaces for innovation.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The next question, Caroline asked, she has a great question related to this topic. Caroline, will you ask your question for everybody?
Yeah, I think I had two questions, but they actually are in the same, which is most importantly, what is it that residents and just general energy consumers, like any people on this call who may not be in the industry, what can they do to help? And also, what's the most pressing thing? What do we all need to kind of change about how we are thinking about this?
So I'll start with the first question. What can the individual person do? So I think it is really important, and again, this is gonna my emergency management background is gonna sort of come out here a little bit. I think it's really important for people to realize that they need to be resilient themselves. So they need to think about with whatever the way the world is moving and the way the climate is changing, that we can have emergencies and we can have disasters. So they need to be resilient themselves. So if you are someone that is particularly dependent on power have a plan for having backup power, because even with, let's say they make the most resilient grid out there, the reality is sometimes the power is still going to go out. So I think it's really important for folks to plan ahead for multi-hour, if not multi-day outages, just to be prepared. It's interesting. I come from the East Coast, and we regularly had the power go out with nor'easters in the wintertime up in the mountains. So it was a normal winter to have a 2 or 3 day outage, a couple of times a winter. In California, when these public safety power shutoffs started being done, obviously those are proactive outages, but it exposed that there's not a inherent cultural resiliency to lack of power that we need to build back up in our everyday life.
I definitely would echo that. I think everybody does need to, and maybe this is the thing, is it is an emergency. I mean, there's no question it's these things are emergencies, and I wouldn't want to call them everyday life, but they are going to happen more often. They are a part of life. And I think that if we can accept that, which comes to the resiliency that Carolyn's talking about, and learn how to deal with it both individually and as part of a larger group, because I think if, there are times, so we're running this, the emergency load response program, which Julie mentioned earlier. And it's a really bizarre thing to be really monitoring the grid constantly. We're really monitoring before 9. We're looking at everything. We're operating on behalf of the utilities for possibly calling an event, basically telling people, we need you to shed load, or we need you to really proactively do something so we don't get to a blackout. And it's one of those things where we're filling a need. So like what Carolyn was talking about, you want to try to find things early on in the process, but I think we have to expect that we might not. So how are we going to deal with that when we get further along in the process? What are we going to do? And so that program is only called, and it's, in combined with Flex Alert, and it's got residential, it's got large commercial customers. It's like, hey, we're right on the verge of a blackout. We need people to do something and to conserve. What you want to do is be able to conserve all along, but also, we're running a program that we hope never gets called. It's an insurance program, and it's a bit odd from a company perspective, but what we're hoping is we get to the point that we never need those programs anymore, because we've really managed these things up front. But if realistically there is going to be an emergency, we need to all pull together so there isn't a blackout. And I think that we can't underestimate the fact that there's power in numbers. And if everybody during a period of time stops doing something, reduces their demand just a little bit, and we can avoid a blackout, that's huge, because a blackout has so many more impacts to other people, to the economy. And so I think it's about really contributing as much as possible, both for your own, like you said, your own self, to make sure that you can withstand some kind of power outage, but also trying to work together to avoid that power outage.
I think all my friends in the fire service, and probably Carolyn, you're going to echo this too, would shoot me if I don't say this. If you live in the wildfire urban interface, it's all about fire preparedness, creating the defensible space around your home. It's your responsibility to do that.
And I'll just add in, assuming that the audience here are sort of maybe entrepreneurs and people in this industry, I would just say my sort of call to action to you all would be to think through how you can use your particular area of expertise, whatever that background is, to help us innovate in one of these areas. Because, whether it's what Beth is working on, Tim's working on, what my department does, all of it is on the leading edge of new. And so there's a lot of opportunity with finding niche areas where you can solve a specific problem that plays a significant part in the larger issue that we're trying to address when it comes to our department focus on wildfire safety, but really it's climate resiliency of the grid.
And to double click on that, I think everybody's very interested in society to work on consumer technology. It's really fast, it has immediate impact. Why would you go work on grid related stuff? It's slow and it's boring. We need to dispel that myth, because it is very much a myth now. I witnessed this firsthand. We are a startup and we move very, very quickly, and we have 6 6-week hardware revisions, 2-week software revisions. You know, we're having immense and immediate impact across California, Utah, Colorado. You know, there's so many entrepreneurs that I get to interact with on a weekly basis that are just working on taking all of the concepts and technologies and processes that have been developed from consumer and now applying it to actual real problems, because none of that matters if we can't adapt to the changing climate.
If I could just add one caveat, because I get pitched a lot of ideas. You know, I personally would love to see people focusing on trying to identify the potential fault before it happens. A lot of people look at satellite and AI and stuff for awareness to respond to the bad thing that already happened. I would love for us to prevent the bad thing from happening, meaning that thing that causes the spark. I think, you know, there's I think a significant amount of opportunity in using technological innovation to be able to stop the spark from happening so that we don't have to worry about responding to the wildfire.
I would just kind of echo the undercurrent in all this is educate yourself. You know, whether it's on the bigger thing or about your own house, like know what is using a lot of power, know what you can do for emergency preparedness. There's a whole education level here. About 2 weeks ago, I ended up without power for 39 hours, which was not wildfire driven, luckily. But I had that, like, a reminder of the experience, and you would think that I would be pretty prepared, and I thought I was, but to Carolyn's point, we went back and really looked at that and said, how can we make sure that we could withstand things longer than that? What could we do if this was, you know, this is going to happen more often? And we were also lucky in the situation because the weather wasn't bad. I could afford to replace all my food in my freezer. You know, there's some things like that. And I think it's important to educate yourself and know what you would do in those circumstances and prepare.
Awesome. For the sake of time, I think we won't have time to take the last question for the audience. And I would just like to make sure that everyone like walks away from this talk with like very clear idea of like the priorities sort of to like mitigate wildfires and grid resiliency and improve grid resiliency. So I have like one last question for the panel, but it says, so if you had a magic wand, what's the one thing you would implement immediately to decrease the number of wildfires? And what's the one thing you would implement to like improve or like optimize grid resiliency? So like if each one of you could give us like, yeah, just one thing for wildfire, one thing for grid resiliency, and it's a magic wand. So you can imagine that you can make it happen like that. I don't know, like, Tim, do you want to go first?
I think I said it before, is we need to have an understanding of the basic control theory is you need to have an understanding of state before you can control anything. And so for us to answer this question, the first thing we need to do is gather a lot of data, but not raw, unstructured data, and equip ourselves with an understanding for what the state is of the grid and the environment, because then we can have robust discussions about how we answer that question. And so being able to identify what are the leading indicators to these failures, exactly what Carolyn says. You know, I've seen this out in the grid myself, where you see those signals over time occurring and you just know that this is going to fail, and you wish that you could be there all the time, measuring that and capturing that information. If we were able to capture that information, then we could all come together as stakeholders to have robust conversations about how we develop new products and new strategies. That's my magic wand.
Okay, awesome. Okay, Caroline, do you want to go next in like?
Yeah, real quickly. So 100% agree with Tim that ultimately there's still a lot more data that we need to collect. So I'm just going to assume that maybe we have all of that. If there was one thing that I think that we could do with a magic wand, but I think it's a lot harder than that, is get rid of all the bare wire in our most high risk areas. There is just simply the way the current grid is built in the vast majority of our distribution network is extremely dangerous given the new risks that we have. And so it's extremely expensive to do that. So it's not something that is simple to just wave a magic wand and do. But I think that we have a significant hurdle ahead of us to replace old infrastructure that is no longer resilient to the climate that we are evolving into.
Okay, very clear. And Beth?
Well, I'd probably echo for the wildfire the same thing that Carolyn just said is, if I could wave a magic wand, everything goes underground, everything's smart, everything's monitored, and it just goes underground right now. And there's no animals or birds that can cause any problems immediately. For the grid resiliency, which obviously that relates to it, I would also make it really easy to just plug into the grid. Again, maybe it's not that easy. It's a big, tough problem, and it connects to Tim's point about interoperability and everything else. But I would just make it really easy, not complex. Just everybody can plug in or off really easy, because I don't think you want so many people off grid. You want everybody to be able to contribute on grid and do it in an easy way and have the data from both the utilities, the distribution system, and those resources go back and forth just like that.
Awesome. It's perfect because it echoes the question we couldn't take on IAN. So like, awesome. Well, thanks to very much. We're going to wrap up now. So can we please have the presentation back on quickly to give a big thank you to everyone who participated in this. So yeah, big thank you to our three speakers. I think the conversation went well. We learned a lot of things. I learned a lot of things, and the audience seemed engaged. So thank you for taking the time to come speak with us today. Next slide, please. I would also like to thank your volunteers who acted backstage to make sure these events go smoothly. So Myra for co-organizing this event with me, Sapna and Remya for getting the word out and preparing all the marketing around these events, Kirpa, Akruti, Iris, and Gina for acting in the shadow today and making sure we have a slideshow, our chat monitor and everything. Thank you so much. And if you want to become a WCS volunteer, please send an email to Kirpa. Next slide, please. So if you like this event, we have more coming up. So reminder, we have the book club discussion next week. We have the summer social gathering in San Francisco at the end of the month. In August, we have an executive leadership workshop, more things coming each month. So don't hesitate to join the network and follow our events and mark your calendar for these upcoming events. And yes, finally, you can join us in the virtual world as we're still much there as we slowly transition out of the virtual conversation and try to bring more of our events offline. And also, if you've missed our previous events, or even if you want to find the recording of this event of today, you can find it on our YouTube channel. Everything is recorded, very convenient. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for your time today, and we're going to stop here. Hope to see you online at the next event. And big thank you again to our three speakers. You were wonderful. Managed to make the topic very understandable from everyone. So that was not a small feat.